Good evening. My name is Nicholas Beshin. I apologize if there's any ums or any kind of weird breaks in this. I am not going off of the script, which is not necessarily a good idea, but that's fine. So really kind of the intent of this video is I'm going to go through kind of the iterative process as far as artificial intelligence and the stuff that I've been doing recently and how that relates to stuff I've done in the past. I've been doing VR game development for a few years now. I'm recently doing architectural visualization, and my current project is doing more AI prototyping. This video that I've got paused on my screen right now is from last year, and it's from an FPS project. And even prior to that, I was doing like some basic, zombie AI kind of stuff where it just comes at you or, run towards you. There was some more interesting stuff with the second unit type, but nothing worth talking about here. And in this project, where it's entirely first-person shooter type stuff, I was trying to get some more interesting AI because I felt like out of the VR shooters that existed at the time, a year ago, there wasn't really any shooters out there that had the kind of engaging, aggressive AI that I wanted, that were taking cover and that were retreating, that were pushing the player, flanking, that kind of stuff. And so this had been my attempt, trying to get that reactive, dynamic kind of combat experience. I'll play like a clip of this. Let me skip ahead a little bit. Yeah, we'll do that firefight there. So I will be talking over a lot of this stuff as I kind of play through these videos. Obviously you can see that the AI are just pills. This was not, I'm not an artist in any way. But that was not necessarily the intent, was making, pretty AI. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because there's not an engagement for a few more seconds. So as of yet, they don't necessarily seem very intelligent. They were more fun to fight in person. Here I'm getting flanked. By listening to the footsteps, notice he's coming. This is kind of more so where things start being more dynamic. So there are a lot of instances there that other VR shooters don't necessarily do. For example, you've got first contact firing, where in Insurgency, for example, Insurgency Sandstorm, the accuracy of the bots is completely random. And so you'll have instances where even if their accuracy might be reduced, they might be on a lower difficulty, where you come around a corner and you get headshotted. Even if it's only 1%, 10% of the time, you still are going to get single shot at some point, and there's no way you could have stood a chance. You came around a corner, the guy had a shotgun, you came running across the road, and the bot had a sniper rifle, and most of the time they miss, depending on their difficulty. But every now and then they will absolutely get that first contact, first shot, and you'll die before you ever even knew that there was a hostile there. Obviously that plays into the meta of the game, but people who actually play it, it's never necessarily fun to get killed by the very first bullet that comes at you. You need to have some kind of warning shot in order for it to be fun. And no, that doesn't sound realistic, but having something that is warning you of its presence, kind of like a metaphor, hypothetically somebody like raising their fist up at you saying they're going to engage a fight. It's one thing to have a fight escalate and to be initiated, but it's another thing to just get punched in the back of the head, lights out, game over. That's not a fight. That's not fun. Being taken out before you have any kind of, point of contact, any initiation isn't fun. So in this case, the accuracy is, I believe in this iteration, it was guaranteed to be a certain degrees off to the left or right. And so that first contact would always be, it wouldn't be something obvious. You wouldn't necessarily notice that they're missing you every time on that first burst. But then from every point after that, you can now increase the difficulty of AI because you've initiated, you've told the player, hey, you're being shot at. And now you can increase the AI reaction time, increase their accuracy in order to compensate for that first contact announcement. But it ends up being a lot more fun for the player. There's multiple instances where these bots are retreating back where they came from, where they're going to pop out and they shoot and then they go back into cover. That's just using a very basic kind of memory system. And overall, even in this AI from last year, I was really proud of it. There were just certain behaviors like taking cover, for example, and also the way that it moved to the player. It, just pathfind directly to the player and navigated directly to them without really any kind of deviation. I never really figured out a way at the time to figure out how I could create variation in that pathing, get them to flank, get them to take cover. The standard in the industry for taking cover is using what are called cover points. So the level designer, either using attachments to cover objects or by just creating flags in the environment, establishes these points of interest that the AI can be listening out for. And then when they get close to that, when it comes within a certain proximity, then they know that they can take cover in that position. They, choose whatever's closest, they do an animation, they get behind cover. But it ends up putting a lot of extra effort on the level designer in order to figure out where those cover points are. And then there's also issues where the player can learn all of those cover points. They don't realize that those cover points are a thing, but they might be clearing through a defense point inside of Insurgency Sandstorm and have memorized all of the possible places where AI can take up positions. They're only going to take up maybe 25% of those because it's going to have a certain amount of randomness as to which ones they occupy, but you still know every single corner to check, just kind of going one down the line, and eventually you click through the building, and it's not nearly as engaging with the unpredictableness. And also, that means that in between points, the level designers don't have enough time to create infinite amounts of cover points. So there's other engagements where the AI cannot take cover. There might coincidentally, they might be behind an object, but they're not actually taking cover intelligently. So these are the kind of behaviors specifically with the taking cover that I wanted to create a dynamic system for. I've heard of other designers attempting to do that and having issues with it, and I can understand why that might be the case, but I wanted to give it a good old college try. Just as comparison, this is the AI chart for my previous FPS. This is our previous FPS AI, the behavior tree. Pretty much there's a procedural weapon system. They would generate their weapon, then they would start their audio cycle for like walking and whatnot. They would wander, they would turn on their eyes because I had a ray casting system that would watch the player once they got into a certain proximity. They had like a shuffling for avoiding friendlies. It didn't work very well in this iteration where they would move randomly in a direction within a certain radius in order to break that line of sight on a friendly so that they wouldn't shoot through them. Once they initiated contact with the player, that's where you'd have reacting to player, and that would initiate every single time that they got eyes on the player. That might be just moving in a random direction, repositioning to the left or right. That might be moving at the player, calculating a pathfinding to the player, moving directly towards them. Sometimes that's going to cause them to move around objects and whatnot, but it's just making a beeline for them, and then move to cover. This is a very simple move to cover. This is just simply remembering the last location that the AI could not see the player. That might be out of date. Depending on how the player is moved, that position might not work anymore, but they still attempt to move to the last known position where they could not see you. And in most cases, that did work decently well, but that's only exactly one position that they're remembering, and if it becomes compromised, they have nothing else. The only other option at that point is to move to that position, which is still vulnerable, or they can reposition, or they can move to the player. You've of course got the attacking aiming. This is just kind of lining up your sights, and then getting the first contact is what I was talking about with having it miss on that first shot always, so that you announce your presence to the player. Kind of like there was one instance in the video where I'm running down the hall and a sniper shoots at me through a crack, and he misses that first shot, and I engage him after that second shot. Fire around, and then if he needs to reload or anything like that. This take damage retreat stuff, the retreating I never got to work. That might as well just be the moving to cover to your last known position. But this worked, but it's not really what I wanted. So this is where I ended up. You don't necessarily have to read any of this. This chart, isn't anything too crazy, but really I just had the idea, and this retreat zone, forward zone is also relevant, of how can I get an AI to be aware of its surroundings without using environmental flags? And so pretty simply, kind of thinking about like point cloud, which I had a video on it, but there's things called point clouds, and you can generate them using like depth information, whether it be in the real world or in the virtual world, and you create all of these coordinates in 3D space, and know that bot doesn't necessarily, or the scanner doesn't necessarily know the exact literal geometry in its entire complexity, but you can set how many of these lasers go out to scan that environment, and then you have all these coordinates, and then because you have your position and that coordinates position and all the relative positions, you can kind of start to create some vague sense of the geometry around you. That's how a lot of 3D scanning technology works in the professional space. So the dumb idea at the time was to okay, how can I do this in real time? It's actually pretty simple. So pretty much this is just a diagram, but you've got the AI here in the center, and he has a configurable amount of scans or lasers that he can send out in front and behind him. And so you decide, okay, I want 16, and then those go out in a field with some amount of variation, just to make sure that it's not always the exact same pattern so that you don't miss things. And so those go out and they hit all of the geometry in the area, and that can be things that they can take cover behind. That might be completely open ground. And then when it scans out and it hits that geometry, it also checks visibility to the target. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a player. Right here I wrote player, but more importantly, it ends up being whatever its target is. And so it knows out of all of the points that it scanned, out of all the geometry in the area, it knows whether or not it had visibility. Hypothetically, if it were to move to that position, would it be able to see the player or its target in its current position? So then it pretty much just chooses whatever is the closest one. Really what it's doing is it has multiple runs of the scan, and it scans that, because of some limitations with Unreal Engine as far as like data sorting, I ended up having to run multiple scans. And so the first one will run within a short range. And then if any of those are successful, if any of those are what kind of position it's looking for, then it just grabs it off of that first scan, first close range deal, and then moves that. It ends up looking more realistic. And then if it's not able to find anything on that first scan, then it doubles its range, and then so on and so forth, until eventually, sorting from closer to farther, it'll find a location. And there's a fallback. If it can't find a location, then it does this whole like reposition dealio. So that was just something on paper that I had made. And so if we go back to the very first video, let's see what this looks like. So let's skip ahead to something more interesting. So really all that's going on here, and this is like the very first kind of iteration, is you've got all of these red bots, and then you've got the blue target, and that's just them scanning individually. This isn't all happening like some big brain deal, it's just individual bots that are scanning the immediate geometry around them and figuring out visibility relative to the bot or to the target. So each one scans their immediate geometry and decides where to move based on that. But this is before they could do any more advanced stuff. This is literally just scanning geometry and getting behind some cover. It's extremely basic. I found out later that it was extremely broken. It was not robust at all. But this was at least the very first iteration of that kind of stuff, where you've got immediate scanning, getting behind cover relative to its target. It couldn't handle multiple targets and all sorts of other edge cases, but we did end up getting to that. So this is a better representation. Let me get the music turned down a little bit. So this now moved from being able to detect your immediate cover, but also your immediate position, like firing positions. So you can see I've got a legend over on the left where the blue is target, red is firing position, and then you've got taking cover in green. And so this is all bots scanning at once, and they're either going to be able to, they're intentionally looking for a firing position or a place to take cover. And so you can't really see it very well, but they randomly distribute throughout the map. And then depending on their immediate vicinity, they'll either get a firing position relative to their target, or they'll take cover, thus the green and the red. And then in some cases, because I have a limit on how many scans are, because you do not want an endless loop for performance reasons. So these white ones are guys that most often have too much complex geometry between them and their target. And there's no way within their scan radius and the amount of attempts they have where they were able to find a position that is either their firing position or taking cover, whichever one that they were looking for. And so the reason there's so many bots on the screen here too was mostly just to show, when you start scaling the system up, how many kind of possible positions there are at any moment, and how even with very basic geometry, you're able to get a large amount of variation. And this, from a gameplay standpoint, would be very appealing, where you can't necessarily predict where the bots are going to be taking cover and where they're going to be coming from. And ideally, it'd be much more dynamic and immersive coming up against these bots. So this is just showing off the cover and the firing position. And I think on the next video, I have a showcase of them being able to do both that while managing multiple targets. So this video, I started actually incorporating some very basic movement and very basic AI. And so, how do I explain this? So this was still pretty broken, but you at least have multiple targets, you have movement, so that these AI are, when they decide, okay, I'm taking cover, I'm moving to a firing position, this extremely basic AI is at least able to interpret this cloud perception, point cloud, this point cloud cover system. So the point cloud cover system is pretty robust, but it's been a challenge getting an AI to actually listen to that data and to utilize it. So that's a whole other challenge. And at this point, it was still very basic, but at least got the idea of getting an AI to listen to that data and then deciding, depending on what data it's given, where to move and moving to the position, and kind of reacting to multiple targets. And so this is, nothing super crazy here. They're kind of just running around endlessly. You've got the usual green means that they're looking for cover, or they're moving to cover. Red means they're moving to a firing position. It's a position that they have line of sight on their current target. And current target is dictated by distance. So there's certain intervals where they're checking to see who is the closest target currently to them. And then as that changes, an enemy might move closer to them, and then they have to switch targets, and then they move to cover to there. But this doesn't necessarily seem like, if you watch an individual bot, it does seem pretty intelligent. And if you like if you're just looking at all of them like we are now, and obviously you're probably listening to me talk a little bit, it's not necessarily very obvious that these guys are thinking kind of intelligently. And keep in mind that they're doing this independently. They're deciding where to move for their firing position. They can look at a target and calculate, you know, not even like moving towards them and then once they see them shoot. They're able to predict that if I move to this location, I will have line of sight on that target and I'll be able to engage them. That's when they're going red, is that they know that they found a position to be able to find a spot that they're going to be able to shoot them. And then green is in relative to their target. Sometimes there's instances where there might be two targets near them, or they're like getting flanked and they're going to move behind cover relative to the closest target, and that can end up kind of exposing their ass to another target. I'm not too worried about that though, because it's kind of realistic, and also it still would create some gameplay for flanking, where if you have multiple players, you know, they're going to be moving, kind of reacting to both of you guys, and you can kind of play into that. So I'm not too worried about them taking cover and then running into somebody else because they were taking cover, because especially they're going to move to cover that's closest to them. I don't think that they were doing that at this point, but they're not going to like run across the fucking map to get cover running into players just because they got flanked. They're going to get to cover relative to their current target within close proximity, unless they can't find any cover. Then they'll start to expand out. So really where it starts to shine though is in my most recent video, where I tried my best to actually follow a target. And so it is the exact same color coding as far as the green means that they're moving to cover, red means that they're moving to a firing position, and yellow means that they're repositioning because they either ran out of scans, they weren't able to find any targets, or they weren't able to find any positions to move to for whatever they were trying to do, or all of the positions were too close to the target and they needed to back up. So yellow means that they just kind of reposition, they shuffle around, and then after a certain amount of time, then their scan is re-enabled and they can make another attempt. There's a limit to how often they can scan due to performance reasons. I don't want them to just infinitely be able to, you know, they get stuck in a corner where they will not be able to find anything and then just scan infinitely and destroy your CPU. So that's why they reposition if they can't find anything at all. I'll turn this up a little bit. So the point of this one was more so to like actually focus on an individual target. And so I try my best. It's difficult like maneuvering around like this, but I was trying my best to actually follow one AI. So you can get a better idea as to kind of what they're thinking, both through like their audio dialogue, through their color coding, and then just kind of relative to whatever the current target is. So this is really where this is kind of the finale of this individual project, is like the AI is working, it's pretty basic, but the whole point was to utilize this point cloud perception system that I've created that allows them to dynamically decide on cover, firing positions, and move from cover to cover seemingly pretty tactically. And they can also do some pretty interesting flanking. In the future, I would like to add more things as far as getting them to communicate, having squad leaders, and actually creating some kind of tactics. But for the most part, they at least have these fundamental tactics as far as getting cover, firing positions, and moving, and all that kind of stuff. So, but they're doing this dynamically. They're not doing this because of some scripting I've done in the level, like in a lot of games. This is something that they're doing completely on their own, scanning their nearby geometry relative to their target, and then placing themselves. I apologize for the audio. I did not realize that my mic was on when I was recording this video, and the video, or the audio from the game, was coming out of my speakers, so there's kind of a bit of an echo going on there, and I apologize for that.
Got cover. Getting cover. Damn it.
That's great.
Getting cover. I'll stop. Cover. I'm taking cover.
Trying to think if I have anything else more that I want to explain. Like I said, this definitely can be developed upon, but my goal was really just to get this kind of dynamic AI. So the idea is that when you're designing a new level, you don't necessarily have to be placing all these cover points. You know, you can create something that's pretty decently artistic, and then you can also increase the fidelity as far as the scanning goes, how many dimensions it's scanning in, and really expand upon that if you needed to. but at least the general concept of having this semi-tactical kind of artificial intelligence is something that I think is pretty exciting, and I'm pretty proud of how it actually turned out. I definitely would like to put it into an actual game, especially like a VR shooter, but obviously there's going to be a lot more work to get that working as far as the actual VR shooter side of things versus just getting this AI working. I mean, the targets aren't even shooting back or anything like that, so there's a lot more complexity. Like, the AI itself could be expanded upon greatly, but that wasn't really the point of this video. That's not the point of this project. More so, these AI currently are purely just trying to utilize that point cloud perception system that is calculating those cover points and calculating those firing positions.
Line of sight. Contact. Son of a... Got cover. Adjusting. Taking cover. I'm taking cover. Taking cover. Fuck. Taking cover. Got cover. Getting cover. Repositioning. Got cover. Son of a bitch. Taking cover. Line of sight.
Yeah, and so that's where I stopped the recording. I appreciate if you happened to listen all the way through and know that this kind of stuff is extremely boring to certain people. But I think that artificial intelligence isn't necessarily something that's been developed too much, especially in first-person shooters in the last decade or so. With the focus on multiplayer being, a major aspect, there are certain games that have decent AI, and so a lot of that is subjective as to whether or not you think. I mean, the AI in Insurgency, for example, is pretty basic, and I keep kind of relating to it just because I have so many hours in that game. But even like in the Division, I really like the AI in that, but I don't necessarily know if everybody would agree with that. Like the Division 2, I really like the way that all the classes behaves and kind of the overall behavior as a whole. Individually, no, they weren't necessarily very smart, but they were fun to fight. The movement of them was interesting and engaging as you were flanking and that kind of stuff. And as they were flanking you, they felt dynamic enough. But in general, artificial intelligence in first-person shooters especially just hasn't been developed very much because of that focus on multiplayer. The single-player campaigns, oftentimes you just need some grunts that are out there kind of run around and shooting and looking like dumbasses just so you can kill them because they're only going to be alive for a few seconds anyway. And so I'm not insulting any development company. It's more so just a matter of priority that it's not important in a lot of cases to have any kind of good AI, especially in a multiplayer-focused game. So in my case, though, I definitely crave having intelligent AI. And no, I'm not. When I say intelligent, I'm not necessarily referring to something that just one-shots you and always knows where you are and it cheats and that kind of shit. But specifically something that is challenging and feels like it's thinking, and is at least faking in a way that the player feels like they have an actual adversary and they're not just, fighting a computer. I think that's a really important system to continue to develop. And I think that there's some really amazing experiences to have where you have an adversary that is endlessly going to challenge you. Rather than just increasing the bot numbers, and if you can actually increase their tactical thinking in a situation and always be able to get a drop on you and then be able to tone that down, of course, as you decrease difficulty. I think it's really an interesting consideration as we continue to expand upon AI and with all the machine learning and neural network type stuff that's going on. That's not what I'm doing here, but that definitely could be something that I would like to mess with in the future. But in the meantime, we are using a point cloud to generate cover points and firing positions, and then a basic AI is able to move from cover to cover and move to those firing positions in order to flank and engage multiple targets and prioritizing them by distance. That is a summary of this, and I should have said that from the very beginning, but here we go. Thank you so much. I appreciate you, whoever you are. Obviously, you don't necessarily get to share this stuff with most people, so thank you. Appreciate it.